Many of you have heard me probably refer to a man named Thomas Merton, who lived the mid-20th century. Thomas Merton was a recent graduation in 1948 of Columbia University. He had begun to make a reputation for himself as a great writer, was living in the midst of New York, making connections to publishers, was in many ways his future was set. But Thomas Merton had this, who had not been particularly religious growing up at all, had this experience in which he was asking himself, what's the meaning of my life? Is this really who I want to be? And through a series of encounters with people of faith, in a series of experiences of religious life, he felt called to be a Trappist monk, which he became, living on a monastery where for the rest of his life in Kentucky. And he began to write, using his skills as a writer. He began to write about his experience, his call to kind of leave the traditional life he felt was part of who he was going to be. And he wrote a famous book. It actually surprised publishers, called The Seven-Story Mountain, an autobiography which talked about this conversion of his heart, this sense in which the typical measurements of what a life should look like had begun to lose its appeal to him. And he wrote many books, became an activist in the 60s, speaking for peace, in a religious dialogue, lived a very different life, connected to God in silence and prayer. His life makes me ask the question, how does one measure one's own life? How does one measure one's own life? In other words, what are the metrics, you will, or the measurements you use to gauge whether we are successful at life and business, whether we are living our best? And it is an odd question, I will admit. Well, how do I measure my life? In part, it's an odd question because our definition of success very much so shapes the very metrics we would choose to use to assess how we're doing in life. Our expectations about what makes us a success, more often than not, is actually something given to us by our culture, by our society, by our communities. All of us, at some point in our lives, ask the question, the meaning, the purpose of our lives. It's a very deeply existential question that shapes our striving, even as we come up with the measurements, the metrics to define success. It's important to realize that what we believe success looks like shapes the very metrics we use. How does one measure one's life? As infants growing up, our metric at its most basic level is to be loved, right? To trust the love of a parent, that it will always be there. Unfortunately for some of us, because of a broken parent or painful circumstances in life, we never really receive the most basic metric, if you will, and spend our lives in search of it. As we grow as children, we learn one important metric of success is good grades, right? I remember my son Noah in junior high kind of startled me. Noah's kind of my thoughtful anarchist, if you will. He asked me an odd question out of the blue. He says, "Dad, why is my whole life," and this was in junior high, "why is my whole life measured by the next 4 years?" And it occurred to me, good-meaning teachers, good-meaning people in his life had encouraged him the importance of doing good in school, making great grades that will get you into good schools, and thus a successful career. His question actually was a pretty good one. At 12 years old, his life was being measured by a grade. He didn't like that. And I didn't have an answer, so I just told him, "Go do your homework," right? Then as we grow into teenagers, our metrics of success really even expand. Questions of the number of friends we have or our popularity among our peers. I mean, these days, you have social media in which your worth, your success, young and old, how many followers you have on Facebook or X or Instagram. The teenage years, if you think about it, are filled with the pressures of tests and social metrics, finding one's definition of what a successful life would look like. Think about all the tests they take, SATs, all the school tests they take, all the pressures to measure up to some metric given to them by others. No wonder they struggle so mightily. Then, as young adults, we begin our careers measured in metrics of finding the right, good job, of seeking promotions, of economic independence, finding a partner, starting a family. Until we come to that point in life where we retire, and for many of us find ourselves lost, because the very metrics we use to measure our lives, the very metrics we used our whole lives, no longer apply. So some have a midlife crisis. Get a new car, maybe a new wife. Because the metrics that we use to measure whether our life is meaningful no longer work. So if you think about it, our lives are a series of metrics defining what success might mean to us. What we weigh, size of our homes, how much retirement we will have, how successful our kids are. We measure everything based on a definition of success given to us by the world around us. And here's the question for us to ponder this morning. What if those metrics are wrong? What if they really aren't measuring what's really important? What if we've been striving for the wrong things? The monk Thomas Merton, as I said, once said, "Your life is shaped by the end you live for." Your life is shaped by the very end you live for. You are made in the image of what you desire. There's a Buddhist meditation, as odd as it sounds, and I've done it, which you sit and you meditate that you see yourself lying on your deathbed. Sounds odd, doesn't it? But as you're lying on that deathbed, you look back on your life and you ask yourself, really, what was the most important things in my life? Those moments when life truly felt meaningful. For most people, it was not a job promotion or the amount of money in their bank account or success measured by all the many expectations we have in life. I imagine if you did that, what you would measure as success, as meaningful, would be something else entirely. Now, on the surface, our Bible text this morning seems about a metric. We might call it the fruit of the vine. It would be very easy to read these words of Jesus, who is the vine, and we, the branches, who turn the fruits into metrics of what it means to be faithful. In fact, there actually appears to be, as you listened, a warning from Jesus that if the branches do not bear fruit, they will be cut off and thrown into fire. Not, for me, a comforting image. Fruit seems to be the metric of success for a spiritual life, a meaningful life, whatever we define that fruit to be. Now, churches struggle with those very metrics themselves as well. What makes a church successful? What is a church fruitful? And what does that look like? It's not uncommon for the church, and I know y'all have heard me say this before, to use those qualities that might seem appropriate in the world in which we live this day. That we measure our success by the 3 B's, right? Buildings, bucks, and butts. Isn't that how we often, as churches, measure success? We yearn for the mega church because they have lots of buildings, lots of bucks, and a lot of butts. Unfortunately, the 3 B's don't show up in the gospel, right? By all measurements of the gospel, those 3 don't even get mentioned. I'm not saying that those 3 things aren't important, but it's not a measurement of a good and meaningful life as a church. Maybe we might kind of cheat and look in Paul's letter to the church in Galatia, where he defines this question of the fruits of the Spirit by when he wrote a letter to the Galatians, and he said, the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Great things, right? I'd much rather measure my life by those metrics, those fruits, than anything else. And yet, if you think about it, how do you measure gentleness? How do you measure kindness? How do you measure generosity? These are qualities of a life lived more than they are anything else. But if you notice in the verses we read, Jesus never defines the fruits. He doesn't define what that metric is. In fact, he seems to be intentionally vague about it. That is because I think the text we read this morning is not necessarily about the fruit that does or does not grow on the branch, but something else entirely. Jesus uses the word in our text this morning, the word abide, 7 times. 7 times. Abide in me as I abide in you, just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit. Because apart from me, you can do nothing. So the Greek word for abide in this text means to remain, to live from, to reside in. So the question isn't what fruit do you bear, but the question is that fruit cannot grow until you really abide in the vine. The branches of the fruit do not grow on its own, but simply by abiding in the vine that is Christ. It strikes me that the fruit isn't about achievement or achieving certain qualities, that really what this text is about, what Jesus is pointing to, is a sense of rootedness in the vine of Christ as the source of everything. Another quote by Thomas Merton. Happiness, he says, is not a matter of intensity or action, but a matter of balance, order, rhythm, and harmony. The fruit we bear grows not by our own actions, but by being in connection to the vine. There's a difference. So if I've noticed, I'm not a big gardener, so I don't really, but if you look at a vine with its branches, one of the things that strikes me about a vine with its branches is it's hard to tell. You see a vine growing or a moss growing upon a brick wall, it's hard to tell what is the vine and which are the branches, that they're all intertwined in together. It's very difficult to tell one from the other. They're all intermixed together. And one last quote by Thomas Merton: the whole idea of compassion is based on a keen awareness of the interdependence of all these living beings, which are all part of one another and all involved in one another. We are the branches interconnected to the vine, and you can't tell us apart. And the call is to abide in that source of love, and that's what gives our life meaning. How many of you have seen the movie Perfect Days? Perfect Days. I know Darcy has, because she told me about it. So, and it's a story, it's a really interesting story. One might say it's a story without really a narrative, but it's a story about this Japanese man, middle-aged, and it follows his daily routine. And the interesting nature of who he is. And it follows his day early morning, and he is a public toilet cleaner. He spends his day simply cleaning toilets, which are quite extravagant in Japan. I didn't know this, but the movie showed this. Beautiful places. But every day he goes and he cleans toilets. And the movie follows kind of his daily rhythm, and you kind of think, well, where's this going? You're not sure it's going anywhere. But you follow him in his life. He wakes up in the morning, and he has a routine. He brushes his teeth. He squirts the water on the plants. He steps out on the porch, a very tiny, poor apartment, very small, and he kind of takes a deep breath, and he looks out, and it's almost like he greets each day, celebrating the sun. It's obvious that as his day goes along, he is fascinated with trees, fascinated with their look. And he actually has a camera nothing digital, but just a camera where he takes pictures of trees on film. Every day, he pops into his van to go clean toilets around Tokyo. Every day, he gets into his van with the cleaning supplies and he pops in a tape that rock and roll is what he listens to. Really kind of cool music. And obvious he enjoys it, and obvious it's incredibly, that it adds joy to his life. And every day he goes and cleans the toilets. And every day at lunch he goes to this one park and eats his small meal, and you see him looking at the trees, the beautiful trees around him. You see him just celebrating the everydayness of the world around him, and takes pictures of those trees. And every day he goes home and goes to the same place to eat a meal and interacts with people around him. And one gets a sense, and one thinks, well, man, I'm going to get bored by this movie pretty soon, right? But it's actually this beautiful meditation on this man's life and the value he had in which he just abided in the world around him. And you catch glimpses of him, of his kindness and humility and generosity. And one gets a sense, it's never said directly, but one gets a sense that he actually was a highly successful businessman, wealthy. And you never told why, but he had decided, chosen a path, much to the horror of his wealthy sister. You really wash bathrooms? Here, this man who's incredibly kind and generous and loving, and he abides. And one gets a sense that the meaning of his life is nothing so grand as some great actions, nothing so grand as changing the world around him, other than the sense in which he abides. In his life, he abides in the trees around him, he abides in the relationships he has. And it is beautiful. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.